So this is LAMBDA malware, the hidden threat in Excel spreadsheets. The talk is about a research I conducted in which I managed to find a new technique for embedding malicious scripts in Excel documents. And let's begin with some of the formalities. So my name is Yonatan Baum. I work for Mimecast as a security researcher for the research team. Mimecast is a cloud-based email security company. We are protecting over 17 million end users worldwide. And my team in particular is in charge of researching attack trends and new types of threats. When it comes to email, one of the most common attack vectors for initial access is the phishing email. One common approach would be to send an email prompting the user to click on an attachment that would then execute malicious code, specifically VBA code. VBA is a programming language by Microsoft, allowing users to code automations and scripts, expanding the capabilities of Microsoft Office products. In this sample in particular, is set to execute once the document is opened. It then spawns a PowerShell process, executing commands from a remote server. Now, if you've been here for the previous talk, you've heard that attachments are rarely used in real-world attacks. One reason would be file scanning. Here's a screenshot from VirusTotal. VirusTotal is an antivirus aggregator. Anyone can upload a file sample to it that will be checked against about 60 different antivirus engines, and a minute later, you would receive a report indicating how many and which engines marked it as malicious. So for the above example, we have 40 out of 60 engines have marked the macro as malicious. So a malicious macro, in theory, is enough for a script kiddie, say, to troll some of his friends, but not sufficient to attack any serious organization. Through the research, I managed to find a technique for embedding malicious scripts that goes from 40 detections to 0. I want to say this again. If your organization is using an antivirus tool to scan incoming attachments, it is incredibly likely that they could have used this technique to attack you, and you would have no way of knowing. In the upcoming talk, you're about to understand how we did it, the research process, and some of my final thoughts about mitigating this type of threat. So let's wind back to late 2022, when Microsoft announced this feature, the Excel LAMBDA. Now, maybe you're not as much of an Excel nerd as I am, and you don't find new features for Excel as such an exciting thing. However, for a resourceful hacker, a new feature in software could mean the difference between successfully infiltrating an organization or not. And lambdas are crucial for our research, so let's delve into it for a bit. Lambdas are essentially a way for the user to create custom functions, expanding with the existing formula sets for Excel. So say you want to have a function that converts from Fahrenheit to Celsius. Use the interface, you give it a name, you define the calculation you'd like to make, and then from that point on, anywhere in the document, you can call your lambda just like you would call any other formula functions like sum, average, etc. Okay. Lambdas are great because they can handle strings and they can calculate the price of a product after a discount. Essentially, they are a way for you to tailor Excel to your specific needs. Say you also have a D&D adventure and you like to have a way to calculate the exact damage a longbow shots inflict on an enemy. With lambdas, you can do that just like that. A bit more about the specifics of lambdas. They are accessible to anyone, regardless of coding knowledge, unlike I previously mentioned VBA macros. The syntax is incredibly simple. They use formulas, it is based on formulas, and you can call other lambdas defined in the document, and it even supports recursion. Finally, they come with plenty of helper functions. If you're familiar with, let's say, Python, you may have heard of map, reduce, and filter. All of them are built-in functions that enhance the usage of lambdas. Excel provides all of those, as well as functions like makeArray, which is used to help users quickly and easily populate entire tables with lambdas. Now, just to be clear, lambdas are first awesome, and they don't only mean incremental value for a specific use case. They can do that if that's what you're into. But they also mean we can now take Excel to a whole new level. For example, here's me creating the Mandelbrot set using lambdas. The Mandelbrot set is a graph created by applying the same calculation over and over again, recursively, many times over a grid, creating this particular shape. Making this shape using plain Excel was virtually impossible before lambdas. After lambdas were introduced, you can do it just like that. So what does it all have to do with our research? When we first learned about lambdas at our team, we figured it might be possible, theoretically, for a hacker to somehow exploit this new feature. And so we constructed a war game research, in which I acted as the hacker, researching lambdas and finding ways I can incorporate them for malicious purposes. Now, whenever I'm conducting a research, it is important to me to lay down my goals and my assumptions. As for the goal, I like to infect one of my teammates' machine using lambdas, as a hacker would, and I'd also like to do it without being detected, which is important because, as we've seen before and as was mentioned earlier, most organizations are scanning incoming attachments, and if they find you as malicious, you won't get through, so it won't be helpful at all. As for the assumptions, I assume that first, macros are enabled. This could be due to a configuration error on the organization part, or maybe some sort of social engineering technique, tricking the user into enabling the macros. I assume that executing malicious PowerShell is a valid proof of concept, so that I don't have to compile an exact virus tailor-made for the specific model of my teammate's machine, just any PowerShell commands. If I can execute PowerShell, I can open a reverse shell. And for a hacker, a reverse shell is more than enough for gaining initial access to a network. I also assume that virus total is a decent indication for stealth. So this goes through the defensive part. When uploading our samples to virus total, we receive a numeric score for how many engines mark them as malicious. Having a numeric score allows us to know how many of the most highly respected antivirus engines in the industry marked our samples as malicious. And if we could go all the way down to 0, it means we can infiltrate and overcome any scanning tool out there, almost. Finally, I assume that no sandboxing is involved. There are several reasons for why sandboxing is out of scope for this particular research. Mainly, sandboxing and dynamic analysis are both highly resource intensive and expensive for the organization to deploy. And so most organizations don't actually sandbox every incoming attachment. Now, once I had my goals and my assumptions laid out in front of me, I began my research, attempting to find ways in which I can even incorporate lambdas in Excel's code execution mechanism, specifically leading me in the direction of Excel 4.0 macros. These are an older implementation of the VBA, of the concept of macros in Excel, predating VBAs, and are implemented as a special and unique type of spreadsheet in which each cell contains a different instruction. You don't have to understand the exact syntax going on here, just notice how it looks and acts just like a spreadsheet. Now, Excel 4.0 macro, just like VBA macros, are very powerful. They can read and write files to the file system and execute binaries, making them much beloved by hackers and very well known to the security community, meaning that alone they won't suffice for bypassing any antivirus engine. One last thing to note about Excel 4.0 macros is that while cells may contain instructions, they may also contain values and formulas. And I got thinking, how about lambdas? And so I constructed my first experiment. I want a simple Excel 4.0 macro that does the exact same thing as the VBA macro we've seen earlier. It spawns a PowerShell process and runs commands from a remote server. Uploaded it to VirusTotal, resulting in 17 detections. This would be our control group. Then, I created a new lambda that does absolutely nothing but returns the exact same payload as before, the PowerShell/sleep blah blah blah. Then, I substituted the hard-coded payload in my Excel 4.0 macro with my lambda. such as that once executed, get payload would evaluate to the payload string PowerShell/C blah blah blah, which would then be executed by the exec instruction for the of the Excel 4.0 instruction. Hit run to make sure it works, and upload it to VirusTotal, resulting in 7 detections. Meaning that already, by simply substituting a hard-coded payload with a Lambda, I managed to fool 10 of the most highly respected antivirus engines out there, because they did not know how they could possibly handle Lambdas, a feature that was publicly available since late 2022 and announced and was in development years before that. Already great progress, but I'd like to go down even further, all the way down to 0. And to do that, I had to research the way antivirus engines differentiate between malicious macros and non-malicious ones. Now, every engine is quite different, and one technique that I'd like to discuss today is called data flow analysis. Let's see it in action. We'll examine this VBA code. It defines a few variables and then executes a binary. The binary could either be Word, which is not malicious by any means, or PowerShell, which would be considered malicious. Now let's see the exact same macro from the perspective of an antivirus engine. Rather than looking at the code as a bunch of lines, it converts it into a graph, a control flow graph, in which each node contains a different instruction of the code. Once the code is converted into the graph, the engine would examine it, looking for any possibly suspicious functions. In particular, the shell function, which can execute binaries. Then, the engine evaluates the graph, node by node, paying special attention to changing variables in values. Once the engine reaches shell, it would examine the content of exec, noticing its value is PowerShell, meaning that the macro is malicious in fact. The absolutely most important thing to understand about data flow analysis is that the more complex a piece of code is, the larger and more difficult to evaluate its corresponding graph becomes. Introducing a technique called obfuscation, something utilized by malwares for years, decades even. Essentially, they are spaghettifying their code as much as possible to make it as difficult as possible for engines to evaluate and then detect, sacrificing performance for stealth. Beginning an arms race between malwares and detection engines, each one trying to one-up the other in sophistication. Now, as previously mentioned, today, more or less, it can be said that the engines have the upper end. They can detect just about any malicious macro out there, overcoming even the most complex of obfuscations, using highly intelligent algorithms and plenty of resources. And I theorized, maybe I could use lambdas to tip the scale in my favor as the hacker. Let's understand how I did it. I wanted to exploit the fact that Excel's Lambda evaluation engine is amazing. It is highly optimized, near instant. You can even say it is excellent. Thank you. No, it's fine. It's so incredible and near instant, I bet it could easily outperform even the most sophisticated of evaluation engines. To make it work, I had to first figure out where in the document itself lambdas are stored. They are stored in an inner XML file called workbook XML. And then I wrote a program that automatically created lambdas for me in the XML file, creating hundreds and thousands of lambdas, each calling the others in very deep recursion, making decisions about the next step dynamically and in difficult to predict ways. Here's me scrolling through the list of lambdas I created using the interface. And while I don't have the exact corresponding graph to it, here's a rough approximation for it. Now, to make it all work, I gave my lambdas another purpose. Not only being as complex as possible, also implementing a symmetric cipher. There's nothing fancy going on here, just a simple XOR file, meaning that I can give it a string input on one end that would be encrypted on the other end, and I could give it an encrypted input that would become decrypted once passing through the lambdas again. We'll see in a second why that's important. Then I took the same Excel 4.0 macro from the control group. I move the payload to a different cell, using it by reference, and I encrypted it using my lambdas. And here's why I did that. Now, whenever an engine would examine the Excel file, the word PowerShell or any other possibly suspicious string is nowhere to be found. There is no way for an engine to know that the document has anything to do with PowerShell without evaluating and executing my generated lambdas for decrypting the payload. Then all that was left to do was add a call to start the first lambda in my chain I previously generated, such as that when evaluating, start would evaluate to the decrypted payload, which would then be executed. I hit run to make sure it works and upload it to a virus total, resulting in 2 detections only. We are so close, but we are not quite there yet. At this point, I attempted thinking with my technique a bit more, making adjustments and seeing if I can lower the number even further, and sadly I couldn't. Eventually I concluded that it seems like for some engines, Excel 4.0 macros are always a cause for suspicion. And it makes sense if you think about it, because I did mention that Excel 4.0 macros are absolutely ancient, released in 1995. Whew. It makes perfect sense for an engine to go, wait, why is this Excel document using Excel 4.0 macros, which are ancient and never used? Something must be going wrong, I'm marking it as malicious. For my intentions, it meant that I had no choice but to find a different approach for executing my code, leading me back in the direction of VBA. Now, sometimes when you're researching, you have to look for a needle in a haystack without even knowing whether or not the needle is actually there, and I had to go through many pages of documentation looking for any possible function or property of VBA I can use for hiding my code. And after thinking a bit, I came across this particularly interesting and convenient function called execute Excel 4 macro. Sounds promising. It does what it says. It takes a string and it executes it just like it would execute an instruction cell on an Excel 4.0 macro. After making some adjustments to my lambdas, I hit run and it worked, and result in 0 detections. Finally, success. At that point, I wrote an email to one of my teammates, sending him the final sample, asking him to click on it. And once he did, all that was left for me to do was to open a port on my machine and wait for him to open, resulting in a remote shell. I can now execute binaries. I can also, for the purpose of persistency, read SSH secrets if I wanted to. Okay. Now, before we move on to the Q&A, we do have time for a Q&A, right? Awesome. I would like to leave you with some of my final thoughts about the research and the type of threats. First, while lambdas are amazing and a game-changing feature for Excel, today's innovation is tomorrow's vulnerability, meaning that hackers can and will go through the exact same process as I just showed you, attempting to find new ways to exploit new features in software you are protecting. Now, it is quite important to know that we checked and we didn't find any lambdas in any malwares or campaigns using lambdas in the wild. But hackers can, the same principles apply for any new update to software. And so, as for some of my recommendations when it comes to mitigating the type of threats, for the InfoSec departments, I would recommend incorporating best practices and limiting users as much as possible. Essentially, if there's no need to use VBA macros for your day-to-day work, why even give the user the option of turning them on? But for any detection engine, what I would recommend is figuring it out, keeping updated with changes and updates to the software you are claiming to protect. and find ways to detect malicious activities that are not only reliant on your current understanding of the program and its code. Because things may change and hackers may find other ways to exploit the program. I truly believe that it is our duty as a security community to protect against all types of threats, old and new. So with that in mind, now will be a good time for questions. Yeah. Sorry? Would you get access to the slide? Would you? I can send it to you later if you like. Okay, yeah. It's a good question. No, lambdas are a standalone feature for Excel. They don't require lambdas to be turned on at all. You can use lambdas without macros. So calling the VBA requires enabling macros, and the VBA is the one calling the lambdas. Yeah, any other questions? Yes?
Are you able to call lambdas remotely? So if you have a lambda that you programmed in your Excel, are you able to point that at a web server and pull another lambda from it remotely?
Oh my god, that's a very interesting question. I don't think so. I know that lambdas are essentially unique to the document itself, so I don't think you can download them from a remote server. I would like to see that happen. Could be. Yeah. Yep.
For detection, why did you use virus tools? Why did you not use something like anti-scan?
We just use Veracel for no particular reason.
Virus tools is ultimately going to scan all the time. So why did you not use something that's like monolithless? Like something that does not actually submit the binary to the secondary?
Honestly, I have no good answer for that. We just use Veracel. Just what made sense at the time. There are certain trade-offs, like actually uploading the samples to the community. We figured that also a good thing. So yeah. Do you have time for another question? Yeah. Daniel. For applying the threat? Oh, I think I understand your question. You're asking, how do I recommend practically mitigating this particular threat? It's a good question. One thing I recommend is that you can have say YARA rules, which we actually wrote down in our team. Disallowing documents that contain both lambdas and VBA or Excel 4.0 macro code. So as I mentioned, there are absolutely no documents out there we could find that utilize both lambdas and macro code VBA or Excel 4.0. And so it would make sense, and you won't have virtually any false positives when blocking all documents that incorporate lambdas as well as VBA and Excel 4.0 macros. So that's tactically what I will recommend. Okay. Any other questions? Yes. One back.
Did you perform some sort of dynamic analysis when the has been running with some vendor? Did it pick it up?
So not at all. We didn't do any dynamic analysis. It was just our scope for our research, but it's also an interesting direction to go to. Yeah.
Defensive controls are the exact same macros that are enabled. Do you think you're not seeing them in the wild because it wouldn't be suitable? Am I understanding that right? The lambda is just a wrapper of the VBA. Like functionality, there's nothing different there. Your defensive controls would be the same as lambda, right? Like what's from a red team perspective, what value is there? We can look
I'm not sure I understand the question. Do you mean what is stopping you from writing a super complex VBA code that also results in zero detections on virus total?
No, so say for blue team to defend us,
Yeah.
we'll just pull the plug by saving the macros and improve policy that.
I would absolutely recommend disabling the macros, yes.
So, on standard, that's done. So, from like, and saying from a red team perspective, like, you're not seeing it in the wild. Is that because the cost of use for doing it just isn't feasible? Like, do we have to implement any more defensive controls? Or?
I don't personally think the reason we haven't seen it in the wild is that it's not feasible, because it quite is scarily feasible to make it work. Like you'd be surprised.
Oh, agree.
I also hope it would remain the case that it's not seen in the wild after this talk. Don't get any ideas. As for any other defensive measures you can take as a blue team, I would say, once again, incorporating best practices, disabling macros entirely, don't even have the option of turning them on. Okay, I think we're out of time. Okay, we're done here.